Natacha Lasorak. Natacha Lasorak completed her PhD in 2023 in École Normale Supérieure in Lyon. Her thesis is entitled Between the Lines, the Concept of Home in Contemporary Anglophone Literature from the Indian Subcontinent. She is a member of the Joint Research Unit, Institut d'Histoire des Représentations et des Idées dans les Modernités, and the Laboratoire Héritage et Création dans le texte et l'image. She works on contemporary Anglophone novels from the Indian subcontinent and teaches in Université Bretagne Sud in Lorient. Today, her presentation is entitled The Long Way Home, Failed Returns in Homebound.
Thank you very much. Okay, there we go. In a poem entitled Walking Home, the Indian poet Sanjukta Dasgupta complicates the notion of home for migrant workers in India. So I'll quote quickly. Suddenly, thousands and thousands of them became homeless. Who asked the migrant workers to return to their native places? Did they walk out, or did they just have to walk out? No one knows, no one asks. No work. Their on-site homes had to be emptied at once. No electricity, no water, no food, no money. No one asked them to stay at home during lockdown. They were turned out of their makeshift homes as they could not work from home. The on-site homes, as Aniti Patnaik notices, is an element of untranslatability. Outside the Indian context, it is difficult to understand what the expression could designate. In Indian literature and culture, however, it becomes quite clear that work migrations to the city often require on-site or makeshift homes, the temporary places which can accommodate workers who come from outside the city. It can be a slum, as in Homebound, or Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance, a small flat shared between a large number of people, as in, oh no, sorry, that's not, as in Madhuri, yes, Madhuri Vijay's The Far Field. These homes, however, draw us far from the usual representations of secure places of shelter that home is supposed to be. And this is perhaps what the title of Puja's novel hints at. Homebound suggests the story of a journey towards the home, homeward bound, as Simon and Garfunkel sing, meaning that the place from which the characters leave, that is Dharavi, Mumbai's biggest slum, is perhaps not considered home. Written as a collection of letters from a teenager to a famous journalist, the novel delineates a return to the village, which proves impossible for the family of the narrator in the spring of 2020 when the COVID crisis hits the country. The journey towards home, in the present case Balhar, Rajasthan, is constantly interrupted, and characters are brought a few steps back in their itineraries. This game of snakes and ladders emphasizes the vulnerability of the travelers and the overpowering authority of the rulers who get to throw the dice. Yet I would argue that the itinerary along highways, train lines, as well as jungle paths draw a nuanced map of India, in which police brutality is countered by villagers' hospitality sometimes. Relying on home studies, I will try and analyze the rhetorics of home and return in your novel, comparing it to other returns and forced displacements in Indian literature written in English. For it seems to me that despite the very perceptible roots in journalism, and despite the fact that it deals with a very contemporary issue, Homebound does rely on a strong literary tradition, somehow, or cultural tradition. And I will analyze that. I will try to analyze. First, looking at the representation of home in the novel before analyzing the concept of return as a forced displacement. Home is a notion that interests me very much, and it interests Meher in Homebound as well. In the novel, it is the subject of many reflective moments. What it means for different persons at different times is regularly expressed. Now, by definition, as Angelica Bammer would argue, home is multifaceted. Semantically, home has always occupied a particularly indeterminate space. It can mean almost simultaneously both the place I have left and the place I am going to, the place I have lost and the new place I have taken up, even if only temporarily. Home may refer to a deeply familiar or foreign space, or it may be no more than a passing point of reference. In the Indian context, the concept of home has been particularly affected by the redefinition of frontiers with partition, and in their introduction to interpreting homes in South Asian literature, the editors Manash Hilal and Sukrita Paul Kumar explain that the volume attempts to give an appraisal of homelessness caused paradoxically by the declaration of nationalistic homes. And so defining the frontiers of the new country created a huge exodus, as Meher's father reminds us in chapter 1. And the mention of partition at the beginning of the novel is not to be discarded because I think it enables us to draw connections between the two events. For if partitions by creating two homelands caused homelessness, the pandemic also enticed governments and people to re-establish the contours of homes, thus this time individual homes, while creating displacement and homelessness. As a smuggler tells our characters, it's a national lockdown boss, biggest in the world. Leaving home is a crime, but we're leaving for home. Is that a crime too? The dialogue, I think, sheds the light on the difficulty to ascribe a fixed point in space to the term home. A home, as the novel repeatedly expresses, is supposedly a safe place. It is where escaping could cease. But at first, it is unclear where is home, particularly for the protagonist. While her father is sure that Mumbai is only the illusion of home, while his native village is his real home, Meher is more doubtful. She writes about Balhar. I tried to force affection onto my memories, some color, but despite all that effort, home only meant doom to me, a laggard dust bowl that had once pushed my father towards suicide. It meant a thief who was determined to rob me of my future had I not escaped it in time. It meant another world where bias ruled the days and anguish the nights. The more I thought about my home, the more fortunate I felt for having fled it, for having built a new one in a land where hope was still legal. Meher's discourse hints at a contradiction within the definition of home. Here, home is a place that you flee rather than the place where escaping could cease, as expressed for refugees in chapter 2. At first, then, it seems that Meher is at home in the city rather than the village, in the adopted rather than the original home. And I think you rely here, Puja, on an opposition which is depicted in literature from the subcontinent, but from other literatures as well. I think we've probably heard about Raymond Williams, who contrasts the country as a place for a natural way of life, I quote, and the city as an achieved center. And the opposition between rural and urban areas pervades Homebound and the preference for a space over another as home. In Mumbai, Meher accesses a better education than she could receive in Balhar, and her mother changes the way she dresses, which Meher reads as a political message. There was a mini rebellion in those cotton blouses, and each time she put them on, she was revolutionary. As Ashish Nandi also reminds us, the Indian city in colonial times seems to promise freedom rather than an ascribed status linked to caste. The city offers anonymity and a form of freedom, the possibility of work and social success for Meher's father. Yet Meher's journey towards Maharashtra and Gujarat offers a different perspective on the city. For a man that our group of characters meet in a jungle village, the city never became his home, a diabolical stepmother at best. In the use of the personification as diabolical stepmother, I am reminded here of Marianne Illion's thesis work on the tension between the epic and the ordinary that she perceives in the modes of representation of the city in Indian literature, with diabolical, which kind of shifts the paradigm towards the epic. And I'm also reminded, of course, of Rohinton Mistri's 1995 novel, A Fine Balance, which represents the city as a bird of prey. Sometimes the city grabs you, sinks its claws into you, and refuses to let go. In Homebound, the city is personified as a stepmother, but the adjective diabolical brings to mind an unhomely home of adoption rather than a comfortable place to stay. Progressively, moreover, we are made privy to Meher's own difficulties in belonging to the city. First, Meher's identity as a villager is ingrained in her body. Her nose ring talks too much, telling her characters about her upbringing. The nose ring highlights her identity as an outsider. More generally, she remarks to the friend she makes on the way, I moved to the city only 4 years ago, and my schoolmates still see me as an outsider. Apparently, Mumbai isn't as mine as it is theirs. And I think the question of whether Mumbai belongs to Meher should not hide the underlying question of belonging, that is, whether Meher belongs in Mumbai. The duality between the two places, which compete as homes for Meher and her family, is highlighted, of course, by the forced displacement that the lockdown imposes. And so I studied a lot of diasporic literature from India and a little bit of Bollywood cinema sometimes. And these cultural elements are replete with fantasies of homegoing as a dream of glorious return, as Salman Rushdie would call it, or Ashish Nandi talks about the coming back to the village from the city as a dream of return. I saw it also in Coolie Woman as a title. So the dream of return is really a commonplace or topos, I think, in Indian literature or from the diaspora. But Homebound tells another story altogether from its very title, because homebound is an adjective to describe a journey homewards, but it also links together a place, home, and a tie. And to be homebound or housebound is also to be tied to the home. This is, of course, what the case for people who go through a lockdown. But the refugees in Homebound are also tied to their homes, I think, in a metaphorical way, because home, the village, is pictured as the only place where they can exist without being illegal. For, as the character notices, leaving home is a crime. It can therefore be a form of determinism or condemnation rather than the dream of a celebratory return. And at the same time, Mumbai seems to work as a magnet in the novel, drawing back its inhabitants, contrarily to A Fine Balance, for example, in which the city pushes its illegal inhabitants further and further away during the state of emergency in the 1970s. In Homebound, the depiction is that of a bind with an unhomely home, which only gets stronger. And within the context of forced displacement, then the character's return is imagined in a very different way from the way it can be in a situation of diaspora. As I reread Homebound, I tried to retrace the main itinerary with steps, and so a series of crossings. Crossing a wall with Banjo, then crossing a river before Thane on a boat, then crossing the Maharashtra-Gujarat border on a bus, and then crossing it back in a mail carrier, then crossing a forest, and then not crossing the border between Gujarat and Rajasthan. And so that's why the journey really reminded me of this game of snakes and ladders, when I thought, okay, take one step forward, 3 steps backward. And in this respect, the convoluted journey also reminded me of other journeys in Indian literature. And I thought about Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss, which depicts a kind of zigzag return for an illegal migrant character, Biju, who decides that he wants to leave New York to go back to his father's home in the Himalayas. And he buys a ticket on Gulf Air, New York, London, Frankfurt, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Bahrain, Karachi, Delhi, Calcutta, so, before taking the bus. Biju finally manages to reach his home after having been robbed of all his possessions up to his shoes, in a series of hardships and deprivations which give a spiritual quality to the humbleness of his return. And going home then is not, or just leaving the city is bound to be difficult. And I think that by mentioning Kanti's march in the very first chapter, or the fact that Meher's mother and aunt keep praying at every shrine that they see, the novel also hints at a spiritual meaning behind the walk home. For leaving home, coming back, our movements imbued with a particular meaning in India, as Ashish Nandi again contends, and that's a long quote, sorry. In the 20th century, Indians, or that matter, all South Asians, have been obsessed with the mythic journey between the village and the city. The journey is mainly from the village to the city, though it sometimes ends with a tragic attempt to return from the city to the village. South Asians have known this journey for centuries. Pilgrimages were always from the mundane village to the city of God and then back to the village. The ones who completed the pilgrimage and returned home had a special status in the community, but so had those who fell on the way. A pilgrimage was a play with the boundaries of self. The idea of the tragic attempt to return from the city to the village is really embodied in Homebound. Homebound starts as a refugee tale, which leads to a kind of Bildungsroman, as you said, coming of age story in which our protagonist becomes more and more aware of the difficulties she will have to face to go home. And the process of going home then turns towards a homegoing, in the sense, thank you, Vanessa, of a homegoing service that is a mass for a funeral. Death is mentioned in the milk carrier, which, as a European reader, definitely recalled imaginaries of trains going to concentration camps as well, and gas chambers, in which people die an airless death, as Meher calls it. And death reappears along the way in Saleha's family death on the railroad, of course. It then closes the novel with the disappearance of Meher herself, who dies an airless death, as she had in fact predicted. If play with the boundaries of the self, as Nandi was saying there is, then it is a play which ends tragically for Meher. The Bildungsroman ends abruptly before she reaches adulthood or her home. And I think the novel here plays with our expectations as readers, particularly in the instability between the journalistic report and the tale, or the children's story, which is what I'll try to tackle now. And that's my thoughts. It's not exactly, but that's my thought. Many journalists have underlined the links between Homebound and journalism. There are journalistic undertones. One journalist says that Homebound is nonfiction masquerading as a novel. So nonfiction masquerading as fiction. And the main character, of course, wants to become a journalist. Yet I would also argue that Homebound also reworks literary genres, exploring narrative displacements of sorts. In fact, from the very beginning of the novel plays with this letter writing. It starts as an epistolary novel, which it is, but the first lines of the letter also indicate a proximity to the genre of the fairy tale. Just a few lines down, the narrator mentions a spell, elves, goblins, characters from a fairy tale world who bear witness to Meher's attempt at writing a story that is making sense of reality by using a narrative frame. And as I thought about the forced displacement of Meher's family, and particularly the moment when they cross a forest, other stories came to mind: The Little Red Riding Hood, or tales that Meher herself mentions, Hansel and Gretel and Hop My Thumb. And the version of the tales I've been told as a child are children's version. And in this regard, intertextuality with the fairy tale can give readers confidence in the fact that Meher will reach home safely, or could give reader confidence. But the use of the fairy tale in the novel challenges this interpretation. And I want to come back to the other moment, which is mainly, a fairy tale moment. Once upon a time in a desert as dry as rust, which I won't read because it's too long, I think. Here, the fairy tale does kind of simplify the story, but Homebound draws attention as well to its own artificiality as a tale, with the usual once upon a time, with the reference to a witch and to Hansel and Gretel. The readers are made aware that the narrator herself is aware that she is in a specific situation of enunciation. The story is simplified with the angry officer who becomes a witch, or the milk truck, which is an ashen home, etc. But it is also to be read, I think, against the end of the preceding chapter, which is a very heavy end. That is, the previous chapter describes the escape from the milk container in which Meher and her fellow passengers thought they would die. So they come out of it. And afterwards, I think the tale really contrasts with the violence of the journey somehow. The fine line between journalism and fiction that Puja navigates along her interest, I think, for the fairy tale, drew me to a comparison with Rohinton mystery, of course. Sorry, again, I studied him for my PhD, so there I am. So Mystery, a Canadian author from Mumbai, depicts in a fine balance 4 intertwined destinies that of 2 tailors who go to the city to make money, a young student who comes to the city for his studies, and a Parsi woman who ends up hosting them all. And in his depiction of certain scenes, he seems to rely on newspaper accounts and tends to use the fairy tale to depict the lives of lower caste families. So I haven't put a quote here because it's a bit long, but there we are. You'll have to trust me on this. And this this use has been, in fact, heavily criticized by Tabish Kher in Babu Fictions. Kher underlined the fact that for the bourgeois or Babu character of the Parsi woman, mystery uses realism when the stories of the coolies, Ishwar and Om Prakash, borrow heavily from other genres, the fantastic, the fairy tale, newspaper reportage, etc. Now, if, as Peter Moray contends, we do away with verisimilitude and we accept that, a fine balance is a patchwork, the diversity of narrative styles is not extremely surprising, but it does remain troubling that only the tailors are given this particular narrative treatment. Now, knowing Mystery's novel and the criticism level at it, I wondered about the use of the fairy tale in Homebound, because when reading the novel, I never really experienced the references to fairies or fairy tale as a kind of derealization. Rather, the fairy tale invited, I think, a focus on reality. Of course, both situations and strategies differ, because Mystery uses the fairy tale for specific characters, when Puja uses it perhaps as a shift from a difficult reality, so more kind of comic relief or something of the sort. And perhaps it is also the kind of story that Meher is able to feed her younger brother, Happy, because it's also Happy who calls back to the genre of the fairy tale, or plays with it with paper bits. And I think at any rate, it gives Meher the only role that she is kind of allowed to take on, that is the one for which she can have agency on her fate, that of the storyteller. So to conclude, I'll just say that, Homebound relies, I think, on the fairy tale all the better to echo the stories of other refugees, the refugees of partition as mentioned, but also of the state of emergency and the slum clearance programs that was particularly in Rohinton Mystery. What starts as a walk, which could almost be read politically in comparison with Gandhi's Salt March, ends up at a story of how, which kind of shows how suffering is made invisible. It is still political, but characters use fiction as a way to reclaim a space in the official narrative. But while it depicts a very recent phenomena and obviously takes its roots in careful observation of the pandemic crisis, I think Homebound also attempts to take its place within an Indian literary tradition. There I am.
Thank you very much, Natacha, for this wonderful talk. Are there any questions or reactions from the audience, or maybe from you, Puja, if you have anything to?
Can I just get a copy of all these things? I think they're helping me understand my processes. So can I just please, yes. Oh, I think you're one of the few people who understood the dual meanings of Homebound. So nobody's got that yet, I think. But
yeah, thank you.
but I really enjoyed it. I'll email you.
Yes, perfect. I'd be glad.
It's too much. I haven't analyzed Indian literature against, and I'm not aware of literary traditions in India because I've kind of read like 3 novels.
Yes, so. Yeah, that's why I modified, because I thought, okay, right, there are these narratives of returns, but I guess you've watched Bollywood movies, right?
Yeah.
So there you are. I think it's they rely on the same. I mean, it's not the same devices, of course, because it's movies that we're talking about. But when I, for my PhD thesis, when I analyzed the rhetorics of return, I encountered a lot of analysis that were about movies more than they were about books, and I saw the same motifs or tropes, which I don't know, find and not find, because it's a different story. It's not diaspora, but it's still interesting. I think that tension between the village and the city that you play with in the novel.
You guys might think I'm stupid, but I really didn't know I was playing with religion. Where I feel so ignorant, but yeah. No, so thank you for that. I don't know what I'm doing, but
you're doing it well. You know. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure authors have to be.
Yeah, I mean, or maybe because I wrote it 4 years ago, so I don't remember. But I don't know. This is like all news to me.
Hopefully, you don't become too conscious about the thing that after
I think it works because I'm not too conscious. Yeah.
So you talked about Bildungsroman being abruptly stopped, and I was wondering if you also made a link with, the friend she made along the road, where it seems to be a sort of new home she was making with new friends. Saleha, she was called.
Wait. Along the road?
Yeah, she met the Muslim family.
Yes, sorry. The Muslim family she meets along the road. Sorry. I thought it was
she meets a friend who is an outlier like her, and it seems to me it seemed as if she was building a new home because she didn't know where to go, and it was beautiful. And then it all started devolving from that tragic event with the Muslim family. And do you think that's something?
Yeah, in fact, it reminds me of the PhD. I look at Vanessa here, who has read it all. I like the idea that you can feel at home with people. So, and I think there is there is this family that she meets, and in this kind of friendship that she develops, which is also interesting because I talked in my thesis about faire famille, and but how to make family. Well, that family has to pass as Hindu, which is also a first basic lie to be able to connect in any way. Otherwise it wouldn't work with the other ones. But there is also this well, it's not exactly family, but it's about hospitality, I guess. I saw it, I think, there are two main examples that come up. One with a village in which they're just, given food and somebody helps them get a bus, which is wonderful. And then the other one in the village in the jungle, and that village, which is a kind of metaphor, for the country somehow, with like the same, place to, I think was a very, I think it's the most, for me, spiritual moment of the book, when they reach that stage, which is so enclosed, so protected, somehow so far from all the rest, and they can just share this connection with people. So yeah, I think there is homemaking in having this, but yeah, the home just disappears.
So this is so strange, because this is the moment which I thought was the most artificial moment. I swear. Yeah, I mean, because I thought I really wanted to include the Hindu-Muslim narrative because it is so integral to the current social political fabric of the country. But I thought it felt deliberate and it felt forced. And I'm so surprised to know that that meant something to you.
Yeah, I wouldn't read it as deliberate or forced. I think it's a kind. For me, it was it's like stepping in a bubble just for the moment when they are in this village. It's kind of a different story at that stage. I don't know, the atmosphere is very different. We leave, I guess we leave aside the cops for once. And so that makes it, and also it's almost initiatory, the fact that they have to follow this man who turns out to be, a poacher, and then who just disappears. And it's just, I felt like I entered, some kind of, I don't know, Zelda or something else, just something really different. So I like that moment, yeah.
Thank you very much, Natacha. I mean, I really advise you to read her PhD, which is on home in contemporary Indian literature, because, of course, I mean, her whole work was about working on the polysemy of home. So your book was absolutely perfect for Natacha. And actually, I'm sure she'll have even more meanings of home that we can find in your book. And I'm looking forward to the translation because translating Homebound will be extremely difficult because of its polysemy. Yes, because of what we said, a direction, but at the same time being tied in a house because of COVID, but also because of traditions. I mean, what you were saying about the traditions in the village that mean that some women have to be placed outside a home, but then they're bound to that home. So I found that it was very interesting, all this polysemy, and you showed that very well. Maybe the one thing that to me was maybe I hadn't thought of it was the spiritual meaning behind the walking home, because I thought that you navigated very well that issue of Muslim, Hindu without, it was done in a very, very subtle way, I thought. And I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit more, Natacha, about this idea of a spiritual meaning. I liked your idea, the way you linked it to a pilgrimage, which it isn't at the same time, because it sort of stays away from a too heavy religious message, let's say.
So because I'm also interested in the idea of walking, or as I in previous interventions, sometimes I talked about just wandering, being a loafer, avara, avara, and these kind of avara. Sorry, and so I'm also interested in what happens in just the fact of walking, and I think it's often linked. I mean, because of Ashish Nandi, this is the person who kind of draws these links for me. That I think there could be a kind of quest. I don't know how exactly. I think I saw it because of those shrines and because of all those crossings, which make the trip initiatory, perhaps. And it's not that they're looking for a shrine, but there is a shrine and there is the march also at the background, something like this. And I think because the story, becomes more and more, as Cecile was saying, there is at some stage, a fall with the death, and so we are also led to wonder about the progress. That is initiation for me, more than just walking home. I don't know. Maybe I'm not. I don't know where I'm going with that. But
very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Other questions, reactions? No? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.